Okay, hello. Since all of you know that we've been going through this major corona crisis, and we had a wonderful program of lectures set up for the spring semester at the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center. So unfortunately, we couldn't have all these public talks. But we thought that maybe in order to compensate for the lack of those programming, we can have a virtual presentations of the all the wonderful speakers that we're planning to invite. I'm Behruz Gamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. And here I am introducing our first speakers of this virtual series, Professor Amy Malek, who is also a visiting scholar at the center for this year. And I'm glad to report that also she will be staying with us next academic year. Professor Malek has a PhD from University of California, Los Angeles in anthropology, and a master's degree from NYU in New York City. And she focuses in her work on the study and ethnography of Iranian diaspora communities. First started in LA and then expanded to Toronto in Canada and now Sweden. And she's been working on this amazing manuscript that soon will be ready and available to all of us to read. Today she's going to talk about her research, and I'm going to ask her to talk for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have a little conversation after her talk. And again, let me thank Professor Malek for participating in this conversation. Here you are, Professor Malek.
Wonderful, thank you, and thanks for having me in this virtual setting. It's an experiment, so I'm going to be using some slides that maybe will help to kind of help follow along, so it's not just me talking. But thank you for your patience as we continue to navigate this new reality.
Thank you.
Okay, so there we go. Everybody seeing slides?
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay, so first I want to start off by saying that this presentation is based on a paper that has recently been published. So the title of the paper is Paradoxes of Dual Nationality, Constraints on Multiple Citizenship in the Iranian Diaspora, and you can find that in the Middle East Journal. I believe it was in the December 2019 issue, published in January, actually. So the focus of the paper is on dual citizenship in the diaspora. And in the last several decades, we've seen a really sharp rise in the increase in the acceptance of dual citizenship around the world. So what was once considered something really suspicious and perhaps the cause of divided loyalties has become much of a global norm. But that trend in non-exclusive citizenship and the acceptance of that is not without its detractors. And we have a growing number a growing number of citizenship scandals around the world that kind of point to the fact that this is an increasingly criticized norm. So politicians and immigration states are questioning the global rise in this kind of citizenship, and especially the impact it has on sovereignty and security. So recent dual citizenship scandals in countries like Australia and Finland and the UK have revealed that despite global trends, anxieties about dual citizenship can still be used as a political tool to mobilize against their, say, political opponents, even in liberal democratic societies. And in countries like the US and Canada, where I'm going to focus most of my attention in this presentation, we also have our fair share of citizenship debates in recent years, whether over Canada's Bill C-24, which I'll talk about more in just a moment, that would have allowed for denaturalization without due process, or recent moves by the US government to increase denaturalization efforts, even in civil cases. And we saw just in February of this year, the creation of a new kind of section in the Department of Justice about, to promote for the prosecution of denaturalization. So these ensuing debates among policymakers, the media, academia, demonstrates that while dual citizenship may be legally accepted, it's not protected from threats calling for a reversal in the near future. And as a consistent target of these kinds of suspicions, Iranian dual citizens offer us a pretty useful case study to help examine how discourse and policy related to securitization vis-a-vis multiple citizenships have constrained mobility, security, job prospects, and access to rights. The sharp rise in the acceptance of and the seeking of multiple citizenships in recent decades has been explained by scholars in the literature, particularly in citizenship studies, political science, as a global shift towards instrumental attitudes, or what several scholars in a recent special issue of Journal of Ethnic Migration Studies, which is here on the screen, they've described it as strategic citizenship or compensatory citizenship. This is a strategic instrumental approach to studying dual citizenship, and it suggests that individuals are pursuing their second or even third or fourth citizenships in order to maximize utility and to gain economic advantages, mobility, a sense of security, perhaps employment, education, political participation, etc. So while these studies offer some fresh data that suggests the global reach of compensatory citizenship continues to grow, the literature that studies dual citizenship continues to emphasize the benefits of this system as accruing solely to individual dual nationals, while the costs either remain understudied or problematically are being theorized to accrue only to states. So for many dual nationals, these strategic instrumental theories are failing to adequately account for the negative or potentially harmful impact of multiple citizenship status on individuals. So what I want to demonstrate in this paper is that while many individuals do in fact seek additional citizenship strategically, others are actually limited in their abilities to realize the full potential of their citizenship protections and rights, whether that's for mobility or employment or any of that list I just showed you. So in some cases, it's not simply limitations or inconveniences, but become threats to the very security that these compensatory theories of dual citizenship are kind of taking for granted. So in the paper, I focus on two of the many related areas that demonstrate the limits of compensatory citizenship as felt by Iranians in diaspora. Yeah. And so the first is the practical problem of renunciation. So this is the practical inability to successfully relinquish Iranian citizenship through official channels. And I'll talk about the actual legal instruments related to that in just a moment. The second is securitization. So with the heightened securitization that we do see happening globally, nevertheless, we have an increased insecurity experienced by Iranian dual nationals in the name of that state security, both at home and abroad. So before I move on, I wanted to give us a brief caveat here. So quickly, the focus on this paper is dual citizens and the theory, politics, experiences, discourses of dual citizenship. But I do not want to suggest that dual citizens are the only or even the primary targets of increased securitization or discrimination, right? So obviously having a second citizenship can be helpful. And there are many instances where people are absolutely, and Iranians, I mean, are absolutely seeking their second or third citizenships for strategic reasons. However, what I'm trying to point to here is that the kinds of discrimination or targeting or surveilling of individuals as a result of increased securitization happens to dual citizens as well, right? So not meant to say only or even mainly. Okay. So first I want to give us just a brief overview of the Iranian diaspora. Who are we really talking about here? So during and after the 1979 revolution, the subsequent Iran-Iraq war, hundreds of thousands of Iranians emigrated, and the Iranian diaspora is now spread to nearly every continent on the planet. The population size of Iranians in diaspora, whether dual citizens or not, is kind of difficult for social scientists to ascertain. And that's thanks to inadequate census counts, the difficulty of counting undocumented immigrants, the challenge of counting second and third generation in diaspora, et cetera. So there's lots of problems with counting. However, if we think about, if we try to account for all of those inconsistencies, we do have an estimate of over 4 million Iranians in diaspora worldwide. And all the caveats of the difficulty of counting in place, if we do use census data around the world to try to get some numbers, we would find likely undercounts. So in the United States, the American Community Survey is our more recent count, somewhere around 500,000 in the US. Community groups often balk at those numbers and say it's probably more like 1 million to 1.5 million. But again, we have an issue with counting. But I wanted to offer some numbers here of where Iranians are in the world and in what numbers. We tend to believe that there's more Iranians in North America and Europe than in other parts of the world. And in that sense, here are some numbers on the screen to offer you just kind of like a baseline for us to start from is what I would say. Add to this the undocumented immigrants, the second and the third generation, those with one Iranian parent and one non, things like that that are kind of hard to count on a consistent way internationally. I should also say that it's not only hard to count the number of Iranians, it's hard to know how many dual citizens there are. Like other countries, Iran doesn't publish the number of dual citizens that have Iranian and some other citizenship. But these kinds of figures that I've shown here, problematic as they may be, let us know that the claim made in 2016 by Iran's intelligence minister, placing the number of Iranian dual citizens at just 40,000, is likely a gross underestimate. The other thing that lets us know that's a gross underestimate is our dual citizenship laws. So the Iranian dual citizenship is based on a jus sanguinis law. So that's a law by descent, right? So it declares any individual born to an Iranian father as a citizen of the Islamic Republic. So dual citizenship is currently tolerated by the Iranian government, which is to say that while additional citizenships aren't officially recognized by the Islamic Republic of Iran, it's also not considered a criminal offense for Iranians to hold more than one citizenship. So in practice, this means Iranian officials only recognize Iranian nationals as Iranians. So second or third citizenships are not formally recognized. And so foreign governments can't intervene on behalf of Iranians, dual nationals, while they're on Iranian soil. And that's going to become an issue in just a minute. We'll see why. So we have a situation where we have a lot of people abroad, right? A lot of them will have Iranian fathers, right? And the other problem is we have the problem of renunciation. So Article 988 of the Iranian Civil Code states that Iranian nationals can only renounce their nationality if they've met certain specific requirements. Among them, they have to be 25 years of age. They have to completed compulsory military service or otherwise have filed an exemption. And they have to have officially been permitted to, quote, leave their nationality by the Council of Ministers. So that's the cabinet of the Prime Minister of the Islamic Republic. You might imagine this latter requirement is an extremely high threshold, and it severely limits the possibility for the success of applications for renunciation to the point that it's commonly understood that renunciation is effectively impossible for Iranian citizens. These kinds of limitations, it's not unique to Iran. Other countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Syria, Sudan, and other countries also have limitations on the renunciation possibilities for their citizens. And so while the Iranian diaspora encompasses a diverse set of religious, ethnic, linguistic, and political identities that lead to very different beliefs about and relationships with the Islamic Republic, the Iranian government views all of these individuals as citizens regardless of differing histories or lapses of documentation. This leads us to what I've called a paradox, and that is that regardless of the desire to hold Iranian citizenship, if one is born to an Iranian father, the status is automatic and practically impossible to reverse. That renunciation paradox becomes a problem for Iranian dual nationals when they're in countries at odds with the Iranian state. And in this case, I'll talk about the US and Canada, though we could talk about other places as well. The prolonged conflict between Iran and the United States since the 1979 revolution and the Iran-Hostage crisis in particular, all the way up through recent US withdrawal from the JCPOA or the Iran deal, and the return of harsh US sanctions provides perhaps the clearest and most instructive case. Though Canada too broke diplomatic relations with Iran in 2012, and again, we can talk more about that. But the inability to renounce has led to many dual nationals feeling stuck, even if they have never been to Iran, even if they have no remaining ties, they never applied for Iranian citizenship, they don't express any loyalty to the country, even those in those positions are still considered Iranian citizens by default by these governments, and therefore remain Iranian citizens in the eyes of those governments. So it's Iranian law that makes it hard to renounce, but it's the policies of the immigration states that prevent these individuals from full inclusion in those states. So these policies reveal a continued suspicion of the allegiances and loyalties of dual nationals and concomitant fears of espionage, terrorism, and treason that evidence the continued power of national sovereignty despite increasing acceptance of non-exclusive citizenship. I want to offer a quick note on methods here. In what follows, I'm going to offer some qualitative data and analysis on the impacts of the renunciation paradox and efforts at heightened securitization through attention to legal scholarship, media, policy papers, social media posts, and data that I collected through 10 semi-structured interviews with 1.5 and second generation dual national Iranians. And these individuals were chosen through purposive sampling. So I was looking specifically for people who had attempted renunciation or who have been pressed to seriously consider doing so, and to understand the challenges they faced in doing that. And so that led me to a series of, say, people working for the US government or government contractors, or those who were seeking employment in security industries, people who would have come across this particular renunciation pressure. Right? So as I want to demonstrate here, the heightened state securitization, suspicion, and scrutiny contributed to patterns of exclusion that led to experiences of heightened insecurity for individuals in at least 3 ways. And so I want to talk about each of these in turn. 1, mobility and legality. 2, employment and the ceilings on career advancement. And 3, identity and belonging. So these are obviously all connected, but I want to take each one in turn. So first, mobility and legality. In the paper, the longer version of this presentation, I go into the ways in which mobility and legality are impacted in the US, in Canada, and in Iran. I have a feeling that our viewers are going to be familiar with the US or more familiar with the US. So I want to just say quickly that the visa waiver program that was initiated by President Obama, and then what comes to be known as the Muslim ban or the travel ban under President Trump, has certainly had deep impacts on family relations, on academic networks, and feelings of inclusion in the US. The securitization at borders is one in particular I'll highlight here, especially because just in January of this year, we saw Iranian American dual citizens being held at the border, questioned by CBP. And this is something that is kind of like in line with the experiences of what people had already experienced, but this was with dual citizens, right? So the American citizens were being held specifically because of their Iranian background, their heritage, or their place of birth. These kinds of negative border experiences and the ramped up government denaturalization programs that I spoke about a moment ago lead to increasing fears and, of course, have impacts on identity and belonging that we'll get to in just a moment. But given that I assume people know more about the US case than maybe other cases, I want to turn to Canada. So in Canada, the situation was particularly heightened in 2014 and 2015. In 2014, the Conservative government passed Bill C-24, and this bill marked a grim shift in the treatment of immigrants by their new home government. It would legalize the stripping of citizenship without recourse to due process for naturalized citizens who committed certain crimes. So terrorism, high treason, fraudulent or false representation to acquire naturalization, etc. The issue is that it did not make those same kinds of qualifications or did not apply those same sets of laws to non-dual citizens. And the reason that it didn't do that was to prevent creating stateless persons. So Canada, like many other governments, has agreed to certain international instruments. In this case, we might talk about the UN Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, that says that they won't strip their citizens of citizenship to create a stateless person. But with dual citizens, stripping them of nationality would not make a stateless person, because theoretically that person would fall back on their original citizenship, right? We know that that's become a major issue. Cases in the United Kingdom have shown particularly that because dual citizenship, say through a bloodline, means that somebody could have never been to that country, has no ties to that country, doesn't know the language of that country, that it's effectively deporting them to a place they've never been, to a society that may not treat them fairly, et cetera. So It's kind of like a slippery idea here, but the point is that by passing this bill, the Canadian government was saying we can denaturalize you if we find you guilty of these crimes, particular crimes, and if you have another citizenship. Right? So critics of this move, including refugee and immigration attorneys, organizations like Amnesty International, viewed the revocation provisions of Bill C-24 as effectively creating a second-class citizenship. And that's a status that would then be created for all naturalized Canadians and dual citizens. Iranian Canadians in particular were vocal in their renewed sense of vulnerability at the passing of this bill. They pointed to the ways in which these laws clearly discriminated against certain citizens, and this would lead to increased suspicion and negative perceptions of them in society, in their workplaces, everywhere, especially given that they could not renounce. So they expressed particular concern over provisions to strip dual nationals of Canadian citizenship for a criminal conviction in another country, regardless of the presence or lack of rule of law or democratic practices in that country. So concerns especially about the ways the Islamic Republic had targeted dual citizens and charged them with vague crimes, Iranian Canadians took to traditional and social media to express their fears. One Iranian Canadian woman, a 1.5 generation immigrant in her 30s, had this to say about the passage of Bill C-24 and it's going into effect in 2015. She said, quote, "I think it's completely un-Canadian. No citizen deserves fewer rights than another. I mean, to say that after 30 years that I'm now a second-class citizen because I wasn't born here scares me. What if I traveled to a non-democratic country and was convicted of breaking some ridiculous law? We all know they exist. Canada can abandon me and revoke my citizenship? I think the part of the bill that strengthens Canadian citizenship, making it harder to obtain, is commendable. But to suddenly treat some citizens as second class, there's no place for that in a modern, multicultural country that was and is built on immigrants. There's one type of citizen, Canadian, end of story," end quote. So here, this woman is describing fears of abandonment and sees a misalignment between these policies and the values she has come to associate with modernity, multiculturalism, and democracy, which she sees as fundamental to a Canadian identity. So several provisions of Bill C-24 were overturned. In May 2017, once the Liberal Party regained control of government, and it was one of the kind of like major campaign issues that led to Prime Minister Trudeau's win in that election. The core of C-24 remains, but the provision regarding terrorism-related crimes that would have created that second-class citizenship status was overturned. Regardless of whether Iranian Canadians would have chosen to maintain their Iranian citizenship or preferred to renounce, the point remains that these policies enacted in the name of securitization without an option to renounce made dual citizenship a default position for which Iranian Canadians were thus placed in a precarious and potentially dangerous second-class position that their non-dual citizen Canadian counterparts did not have to fear. Despite then candidate Trudeau having famously argued in 2015 that, quote, "a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian," it has been reported that the Trudeau government pursued those citizenship revocations at the same or higher rate as Harper's had done before overturning it. And even more problematically, without an option of renunciation, Iranians and other dual citizens in a similar position were placed in an even lower, even more precarious status than those dual citizens who did have the option to renounce, as undesirable and as unfair as that option may be. So before I move on to the next piece, I do want to mention, of course, the situation of dual nationals in Iran, right? So contrary to statements of invitation and goodwill by the Islamic Republic for decades, Iranian dual nationals increasingly have become the targets of surveillance, arrest, and detention by the Iranian government, with several high-profile cases of American, Canadian, British, Swedish, and other Iranian dual national citizens, particularly journalists, business people, academics, and these are often charged with vague crimes relating to national security, espionage, or often unspecified charges. According to Reuters and the New York Times, as of July 2018, Iran was holding 12 dual nationals, and between 2015 and 2018 had arrested at least 30. Several more cases were reported in 2019, including anthropologist Fariba Adel-Kha, and these rising figures and reports have led organizations like Human Rights Watch to describe Iran's actions as, quote, "a targeted campaign against dual nationals," end quote. Through these cases, sometimes referred to as, quote, "trade bait" or hostage diplomacy, it's evident that securitization has not only affected dual nationals in diaspora, but in Iran as well. There's a lot to be said about this, but given the time constraints here, I just want to note here that these cases demonstrate that in these and in other ways, geopolitics constrain the rights to mobility for Iranian dual nationals as well, through this heightened securitization in Iran as well as outside of it. Okay, so that's legality and mobility. I want to move into employment. So the effect of the renunciation paradox and securitization has particularly impacted 1.5 generation Iranians. That's Iranians who were born in Iran, but who moved to outside of the country as a child, usually up until like the early teens. That's the way the literature describes 1.5 generation. So it particularly impacts those individuals who are seeking employment in government or with government contractors. Interviews provide a window into how Iranian dual citizens in defense, security, legal, and translation industries have faced increased scrutiny, both in the job seeking process, as well as in acquiring security clearance in order to successfully complete their jobs. It also impacts their ability to progress in their careers apace with their non-Iranian compatriots. For example, Sohaila, a Swedish-Iranian dual citizen and legal professional in her 30s, earned her law degree in the United States. She was offered a job at a large US government contractor upon graduation on the condition that she renounce her Iranian citizenship before the job began. Determined to renounce in exchange for the opportunity to work in the United States in what she described as her dream job, Sohaila quickly completed the necessary paperwork and submitted it to the Iranian authorities. She waited and waited and waited and heard nothing. The process was so onerous and slow. Her job offer was eventually rescinded and the post was filled. So she was forced to leave the United States to return to Sweden looking for employment, and she leaving behind her education and her skills, or taking with her, her education and her skills. So for 1.5 generation Iranian American dual citizen Milad, his role as a Persian English translator for a US government contractor in the DC area required a security clearance, which he was eventually granted. But as an Iranian-born naturalized American citizen, he felt he still faced limitations. In his late 30s, Milad considers the US his home. His Iranian passport has expired. He does not intend to ever go back to Iran, not even for a visit. However, he said in our interview that he shares an understanding with other Iranians in his field that there's an unofficial limit on the level of security clearance granted to Iranian dual nationals, especially for those who were born in Iran, regardless of their age of migration. So even if they left Iran at the age of 2, they felt that this was still providing an unofficial limit on what they could do. This limitation effectively places a ceiling on projects that Milad is assigned, and thus bars his prospects for promotion based solely on his place of birth and this dual nationality status, a status he's prevented from legally renouncing. As a result of his dual citizenship, Milad worries that the job he loves and has been successful at for years is, quote, just a job, not a career in which he can advance. This is a situation he called a catch-22. And these kinds of limitations are effectively barring dual nationals from fully participating in their professional lives and from serving their governments as trusted and loyal citizens, regardless of having weak, if not fully discontinued, personal ties with Iran. As legal scholar Peter Spiro has noted in similar cases, the US State Department views dual citizenship as indicating a, quote, foreign preference, and that designation, it legally allows for a limiting of security clearance. The Department of Defense suggests that this foreign preference designation can only be overcome through renunciation. And this willingness to renounce can be declared, but you can't actually, as an Iranian and other countries that have this problem, show evidence of successful renunciation. Okay. Finally, identity and belonging. So the increased scrutiny and mistrust that dual nationals face in these industries is also impacting a sense of belonging and inclusion in America, especially for the second generation, those who are born in the United States in this case, or born in diaspora. Even though 34-year-old Iranian American Nushin's job as a lawyer in a US federal agency in California has nothing to do with Iran, foreign affairs, or international politics, her screening interviews nevertheless took twice as long as those of her non-Iranian colleagues, even those who were also dual citizens or married to non-citizens. The additional questions she was asked, which were typical of those reported across my respondents, included requests for details about her Iranian family members, her and their connections to Iranians and the Iranian government, and her Iranian citizenship and passport. This latter category of questions was particularly memorable for Nushin, and they included whether she would, if asked, be willing to renounce her Iranian citizenship, and barring that, if she'd be willing to not renew her passport. The second follow-up question about passport non-renewal was asked by a US government official when Nushin described her effective inability to renounce. These questions reveal a concern about the maintenance of connection to Iran by any means, including those theoretically afforded to non-Iranians like travel. Nushin stated in our interview that the increased scrutiny she came under for her Iranian nationality felt like a targeted attack on her belonging in the United States. Despite having been born in California, being a lawyer, fully aware of her rights as a citizen, she said, quote, basically, they were trying to find out what my allegiances were. If I ever had to choose one over the other, what would I choose? In America, you're not supposed to have to choose. That's the thing. And that they would ask me to consider it when my job had nothing to do with this. It just didn't seem reasonable. Nushin's disappointment in this questioning echoes Spiro's argument that such questions in the context of the security clearance interview, quote, force a choice that shouldn't be forced between a job and an identity, end quote. In considering her interviewer's question of making the choice to not renew her passport, Nushin had responded asking how would she be able to return to Iran without it, given her inability to renounce. Her interviewer found the question perplexing, and it revealed an understanding of dual citizenship as a status only desirable or tolerable for connecting individuals to nuclear families, not to places, nor identities, nor memories. When the interviewer asked, but you told me you don't really have close family there, why would you even want to go back? Nushin reflected how such questioning revealed a continued suspicion of dual citizens in the US government and the way she felt that her identity and belonging in the US was increasingly under suspicion. She said, quote, I have never really considered myself only American, so it just seemed really harsh to have to. It felt like you were giving up more than just a piece of paper, or more than just a claim to a country that where I've never lived. So much more than that. It's so much of what surrounds me, but less and less because I work and I'm away from my family. So I think that's all the more reason to want to keep the pieces that you can, end quote. This reflection on what her dual citizenship meant to Nushin complicates theories that only attend to one side of an assumed binary of the instrumental strategic versus the symbolic meanings of citizenship. Studies of other dual nationals, for example, Hong Kong Canadians, have similarly concluded that instrumental and symbolic meanings of citizenship are inextricably intertwined. Even with the sometimes tenuous ties to Iran among second-generation dual nationals in the US, and as Nushin indicated, sometimes because of the increasingly tenuous nature of those ties, the symbolic move of renunciation proved to be, quote, a big decision that several interview respondents saw as both undesirable and contrary to their fundamental understanding of American identity as inclusive and multicultural. In response to political decisions, like the reinstating of economic sanctions on Iran by the Trump administration, other Iranian American respondents reported being asked to declare any second citizenships for their internships and entry-level job applications, when applying for bank accounts, and even in scholarship applications. In these and other ways, 1.5 and second-generation Iranian American dual citizens who have committed their careers to serving the United States said they've experienced a sense of increased surveillance and suspicion. They reported discomfort with being targeted for their nationality in application settings, let alone in employment settings where they have been challenged to assuage doubts about their loyalties in order to succeed in their professional lives. Regardless of whether they would renounce their Iranian citizenship if it was possible, the fact that they're unable to do so leaves them in a catch-22, as Milad had put it. Further, because of such suspicions, questions, increased scrutiny, reassignments, and denials of employment by private firms can be described as related to national security, there's little legal recourse for Iranian dual citizens who feel they have faced employment discrimination solely due to national origin, even if they could somehow prove it. So just to quickly conclude, there's a lot more in the actual published paper here, but just to quickly wrap up. The Iranian case raises questions as to the experiences of non-belonging that dual citizens have reported and the effects of second-class citizenship on lived realities like employment, mobility, voting rights, and safety and security. Particularly in the geopolitical climate of the last 40 years, for Iranian dual citizens, questions about the meaning of, quote, being Iranian are inflected by juridical and legal constraints as much as by social and political ones. As my interview respondents showed, while passports and political citizenship may not always be thought of as critical to identity, they suddenly become so when asked by an employer or potential employer to not renew a passport, or worse, to renounce it forever. In these diasporic settings, Iranian dual nationals are reminded that despite working to integrate and demonstrate their Americanness or Swedishness, doing so does not protect them from being targeted as the winds of politics blow ever harder against Iran. For those in the second generation, the issue of choice takes on important valence. While naturalized citizens have ostensibly chosen to migrate, more or less, and to naturalize, thereby agreeing to abide by the laws of their new home that may include renunciation of previous citizenships, second-generation Iranian dual citizens who acquire citizenship through jus sanguinis have neither chosen to migrate nor to naturalize. Thus, renunciation and insecurity paradoxes perhaps weigh heaviest upon this group, despite the likelihood that they have experienced the majority of their lives outside of the ancestral homeland and thus potentially hold stronger allegiance to their diasporic homes. Despite theories of compensatory citizenship that suggest otherwise, by virtue of place of birth, jus sanguinis, and an inability to renounce, these Iranian dual citizens are placed in a paradoxical and liminal position that prevents their full access to rights, mobility, and security promised by their multiple citizenships. I'll end there.
Thank you so much. Let's go back to our, yes, that's right. Thank you so much. This is such a fascinating topic, and particularly because so many of Iranians who now live in the U.S. and Canada and other places around the world deal with this issue, and it raises a number of interesting questions for me. But first, I wanted to see how. Obviously, this Iranian case at this particular historical conjuncture is quite distinct. We don't have other cases that this issue of dual citizenship is played out both at the sort of employment identity level or in terms of possibilities of travel and legal status. Are there any other cases in this moment that resembles the Iranian case? And also, how can we compare this case historically with other cases? I mean, one case that obviously comes to mind is the Japanese Americans case during World War II. Of course, so far, fortunately, the Iranian situation is not all that bad. That's similar to the Japanese American case. But how do we make sense of this historically and comparatively to other cases of dual citizenship?
Yeah, it's a good question. In the paper, I kind of extend that this point to say that, on the one hand, I don't think that this is just about something, essentially Iranian. This is very much a feature of now, right? This is a geopolitical moment, and that as things change geopolitically, it could be a different country that faces this kind of, or the citizens of different countries that face the same kind of paradoxes, right? So, and I think that's true. But if we think about historically where we've seen it, one thing I would say is that dual citizenship has not been common for a long time, right? We're talking about something only several decades in the making, right? So to look too far back historically, we're not going to find a great example. But there are things that we can look to that are perhaps contributing to this situation for Iranians that might help us think about how other groups can be impacted in the future, let's say. So for example, this renunciation issue, were renunciation not as big of a challenge for some dual citizens, it would help solve some of the problems, right? And of course, not everyone is willing to renounce, right? And they want to maintain those connections, not just in their hearts, but through their legal status. So I think it might be interesting to think about groups like, this is the thing. When we think about geopolitics, it feels very much in the now, and so it's hard to come up with
That's
that.
That's right.
What
totally, yeah.
Group could be. But if we think about North Koreans, right?
Yeah.
Because geopolitically, so many are let's say, against the North Korean state, or included in the axis of evil that that placed us in this situation, right? But because defectors are seen as defectors, right? They're maybe accepted in different ways, depending on the country, right? They're not always accepted, and their acceptance is very much conditional as well. I mean, this is me trying to like come up with a good cognate at the moment, but you know, given the kinds, especially in the context of the United States, especially given the relationship of the United States and Iran since the 1980s and the continued antagonism between those countries, there are a few countries that I can think of, because we have the fall of the Soviet Union, so we lose that kind of like, you know, enemy status there, or you know,
of course,
our fellow axis of evil members have dropped off. So it's not clear to me what other cognates we could come up with.
I think, you know, many people, of course, argue that this current situation about in relation to Iranians' dual citizenship is basically a substitute for strategic diplomacy, you know, and on both sides, in the sense that this kind of harassment and arrest of dual citizens in Iran, and the equivalent of that also, of course, happens in the US. And these are sort of the substitute for diplomatic engagement. And then both sides have found this possible venue to exercise their political authority through creating this kind of unpleasant situation for many dual citizens of both countries.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going into that just a little bit in the paper as well, this kind of idea of hostage diplomacy or trade bait. So like intimidating, harassing, surveilling, and then to the extent of imprisonment of dual nationals, and then using them as a way to kind of negotiate with the other side, so to speak. And as you rightly point out, it's not just the Iranian government that has done this. Also, we have cases of the United States government doing this to Iranians in the US, which I mentioned in the paper as well. So it's kind of it's a tricky one to figure out in terms of like, as a dual citizen, what do you do? Like, how do you navigate?
No, that's a very important question, and I want us to move on to another question, which is rather another paradoxical kind of situation for Iranians. As you pointed out, the citizenship transfers from father to children according to Iranian laws, and for many years now they have been trying to change the law in Iran to include the transfer of citizenship through mothers, and I wonder, this is a sort of create an interesting predicament for a lot of children of Iranian mothers who are born in the US, because then, you know, as you so nicely mentioned, then it's not your choice. I mean, you if you automatically become an Iranian citizen, then you carry all those predicaments with you throughout your life, because obviously you can't, for all practical purposes, renounce your Iranian citizenship. So I wonder if there is a conversation among Iranians, Iranian diaspora communities, whether or not there is a support for this new legislation in Iran to transfer of citizenship through mother, or not.
So
is there a conversation happening there at all?
There is conversation, and I mean, I can only speak to kind of the like one-on-one conversations I've had with mothers, right? And I mean, for a long time, the struggle has been in order to gain that option, right? To have citizenship for their children, so that they can go to Iran and meet their grandparents or their family, see where their parents grew up or grandparents lived, create that kind of bond with another part of them. And so largely this move that I think it was just in the fall of last year, we had new legislation that allows for the children of Iranian mothers and foreign fathers to apply for citizenship. So it's not automatic as yet. I don't know that it will be, but that question then becomes, so do we actually apply for it, right? So on the one hand, it allows for that kind of, theoretically allows for mobility and allows for access to certain rights in Iran that have been prevented. And this, I should say, I mean, a lot of the advocacy for the change of that law was not about the diaspora, right? It was about the children of Iranian mothers and Afghan fathers in Iran.
That's correct.
Kind of disenfranchisement and discrimination that those families were facing.
And the estimate is that around 2 million children of Iranian mothers and Afghan fathers are there. So overnight they can add 2 million to the number of citizens.
Well, upon application, remember.
Upon application. But presumably all those people who live in Iran would apply because...
presumably, I mean, we'll see how difficult they make that process or how onerous it is to access. But it does seem like they're the main, targets of this kind of legislation and benefactors of it. Now, in diaspora, the people that I've spoken to are the ones who were wanting this, right? So I have not heard from those who have said, wait, I don't want my kid to have this. I don't want my child to be suddenly given this citizenship status. And because it's by application, that's still not really a conversation that I've heard much of. I've more heard of, okay, maybe now we can actually like reunite the family for a reunion, next summer. Obviously, things changed since last fall that have made that
That's right.
additionally difficult to imagine. But the fact that it transfers automatically to children of Iranian fathers has been the source of this kind of like paradoxical situation alongside, like I mentioned, the laws of immigration states that make their status kind of like an essential legal status that they can't do anything about, right? But the fact that now children of mothers have that option, the fact that it's an option is a very important distinction, I think.
Yes, that's really amazing. I mean, of course, when you put all these questions in its own context, they all have totally different meaning. For example, as you mentioned, if you put that in the context of children of Iranian women and Afghan fathers in Iran, then of course possibly that was the main incentive behind that legislation, and they were not thinking about
certainly the activists who pushed for it. That was their main
that
goal.
was their main goal. That's right. You mentioned this issue of belonging, and many years ago I wrote this little paper on Muslim communities in the U.S. Of Palestinian origin, and there I tried to play with this concept of sort of a diasporic paradox, as the way you articulated it, in terms of longing and belonging, and how do you negotiate between these two parts of yourself that both can have legal implications and implications in terms of identity, ways of life, and building communities. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this kind of paradox of longing and belonging.
Yeah. I mean, this is a major kind of like focus of a lot of early diaspora scholarship was kind of, or diaspora studies rather, scholarship that was, kind of, am I belonging neither here nor there? Am I belonging here and there? Does it kind of slip between those in a given moment? And since identity is theorized as a constant process of becoming, we're never focused, we're never only one thing, and that kind of sense of identity is always shifting and changing depending on circumstances and how life proceeds. Whether one is more longing or more belonging also can vary. And I do think that the longing and the belonging kind of are not so much a binary as we may originally think, right? They're very much intertwined in a lot of ways. That the way of being in diaspora often is this kind of like enmeshing of both seeking belonging and longing for belonging, right? As much
we can play that loopy loop very.
I mean, you can do the Pomo thing with parentheses and the B. Right. I mean, there's the slash. We've done all kinds of things with longing and belonging. But I think in diaspora particularly, I'm thinking more about like second generation, like when you're born in a place, and yet you still, you know, and I say that meaning that you're going to school with and you're socialized with other, let's say Americans, and yet nevertheless never feel fully accepted as American. You're always questioned whether, and I don't just mean by as Iranians, and just any, you know, any particular immigrant may have this experience or not, but not being asked where are you really from, and know where are you really from, you know, that kind of second guessing of your American identity is something that I think, you know, a lot of second generation immigrants and third, fourth, you know, it continues for some groups, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans who've been here for generations, nevertheless, continue to face those kinds of questions about belonging. So the belonging and longing thing can extend for generations, and it really is something that I've seen scholars kind of move in multiple directions with. On the one hand, this kind of focus on a lack, or this kind of dystopic kind of I belong nowhere, I have no home any longer, you know, I'm constantly longing for belonging, right?
That's right.
But also a kind of shift away from that and thinking like, or maybe I belong everywhere, like this kind of cosmopolitan kind of look at belonging as something that I belong to Earth, I belong to humanity, I don't belong to a nation state, right? I don't belong to one particular place. I have many homes, right? And I don't think anyone stays in one of those positions forever. I think there's a lot of vacillating and a lot of kind of negotiating of those positions.
That's right. I mean, of course, I mean, there's so many questions that you know we can talk for a long time here. But I want to ask one or two more questions and let you go back to your work. Just sort of a personal anecdote that I don't remember what year was the World Cup soccer games in Paris when Iran and US
97, is that right?
98, I think maybe 98, something like that. I remember watching that game at a friend's house in California, and as you know, Iranians have been a very successful community in terms of professionalism, and these are sort of a group of people who are quite successful and assimilated, and they're teenage kids, most of whom at that time did not speak Farsi at all. And we were all watching the game together. It was so shocking to me that this kind of raw nationalism coming from these teenagers, you know, even when the Iranian players were trying to be nice and friendly to Americans, they protested that kind of gesture by Iranian players. I thought that this kind of is such a mysterious thing that these are a community of teenagers who, for all practical purposes, have nothing to do with anything Iranians in their everyday lives. But suddenly in that moment, this kind of pouring out of this very deep sense of nationalism was quite shocking to me. I wonder, and then I heard this from so many other people, that they're all shocked that how their children were reacting. I was wondering if there is anything in the literature that points to that moment as a marker of, or that was just a fleeting moment that came and left, or it's really played a role in shaping a new form of consciousness for that generation.
You mentioned that, and as I'm writing my book, I've got a section of like these key kind of moments in the Iranian diaspora, both positive and negative, both kind of in the way of like moments that tied us all together, right? We can certainly, that World Cup moment was one of the first, right? And subsequent World Cups in which Iran's qualified have certainly been those moments where we all kind of feel aligned in an hour and a half. I can point to a couple others, but that question about why the children of immigrants, they were born in the US?
Yes.
Yeah. why they would feel this kind of connection. I think one thing that you mentioned that stood out to me is that you've said that Iran doesn't really play a role in their everyday lives, and I would question that. Right? There's an assumption that it
right.
doesn't, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case. A lot of the times it's, maybe at home, it's maybe the way their parents speak to them, or the way the food that they eat, or the kinds of music they listen to, or these kinds of things that we kind of take for granted in everyday life. But they are things that set them apart from their other American friends, right? So like in a school setting.
That's right.
I was born in the United States. I have an Iranian father. I had an American mother. And so, you could say I'm like Iranian American, like really as they come. But certainly growing up, I definitely had Iran in my everyday life.
Right. And these are more at the level of what the American sociologist Harold Garfinkel says that seen but unnoticed. Seen but unnoticed. They're everywhere, but it doesn't.
It may not register.
It doesn't register, right? But and then suddenly you realize it registers in these moments.
Absolutely. That those, and in fact, for a lot of young people, it's. Depending on where they are in the country, and it certainly does vary, but with the young people I've worked with in the past, especially those who are not in strong Iranian communities, their Iranianness has been something that's always been a negative in public, right? It's always been construed as something to hide or something to be ashamed of. And here was a moment where they could say, oh, but this is actually a good thing. And look at us just like dominating, or in some way see it differently. And I do think that's changed a little bit. I mean, like those kids are now adults, right?
Yes.
And the kids that have come after them, there are more Iranians in Iranian American media now. There are more books, more music, more films. There's more kind of a mainstream identity that they can look to. When we were kids, it was just the news, right? And the news was not good. So I think I'm hopeful anyway that there has been a kind of at least broadening of the image of Iranians in American mainstream Europe as well. Some people aren't happy with the direction that's gone, say with Shahs of Sunset or some of the other kinds of one stereotype replacing the other. But I would argue that at least there's multiple.
There's a presence. There's a significant presence.
Right. There's an opening there that we can hopefully make even more diverse and more representative.
That was so wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. And of course, I will see you when things open up again and in person. And I really appreciate you devoting some time for this conversation and wonderful presentation. And
thank
be
you.
safe there, and
you too.
And I'll see you hopefully very soon.
Likewise. I hope everyone stays safe.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.